Hello everyone, today we make our first book review, which is something that we never try to guess, mostly because I didn't have enough time to dedicate to read in the last 3, comprehensive ones at least. I did read a lot, but mostly at chunks and or maybe in, of course, entire monographies, but still aimed at finding certain specific information and not really reading them for eventually delivering the knowledge to Schwerpunkt that is based on a different on a different concept, as you understand. So as you read from the title, today we discuss a very famous, I would say one of the few maybe famous books that, at least in the environment, a bit historical interest. If you go on the internet, on Facebook groups, etc., it seems like a generic enough work, and that's in fact the problem that we will talk about today, to be discussed bit by everybody, giving a bit the illusion that this is the great explanation. We're talking about Guns, Germs and Steel, The Fates of Human Societies. This was edited for the first time in 1997, which sounds like prehistory, and for especially for some reasons that start with the premises of the work, right? Because the work changed dramatically regarding certain approaches to history, but to specifically certain issues that were the motivation for Jared Mason Diamond, his author, to address this topic. First of all, I would say, of course, I don't have a properly I'll say, okay, I have a negative idea of this book, but it's not negative in the sense that you shouldn't read it, or it's bad to read, or there is something atrocious in it. It's just, I believe it's incorrect, mainly from a properly historical point of view, in a methodological sense. For the rest, I would like to stress instead that not only I liked the book in itself, it's enjoyable to read, it contains a lot of interesting information, but I also like the author through the way he writes. He's surely biased, and he's very honest about it, so that's something I respect, because we are all biased. We should always explain where we come from in that sense and why this is being written. So in that regard, I have no problems with it, right? I just disagree, generally speaking, with the method he used, and more than else, I will disagree with the. I will criticize, let's say, better the popular approach to this work, right? And why it was so successful, and why it's still regarded enthusiastically. I would say I've met a lot of people, not very close acquaintances, but I've met a lot of people I interacted with that were enthusiastic about it. People that were also academics, that were interested, other history enthusiasts or historians, and I've read this book instead knowing that there was something wrong in it since the beginning, because naturally it arose some perplexities, to say the least, and I. Since, as you know, I stopped writing my thesis after all this time, I wanted to relax a bit, and I read this book in a couple of days. I had it in a version, it's translated my native language, by the way. It's as different, even a different title, but it's the format 300 pages, right? And so it's a consistent work, telling the truth. Probably the original was even longer, because it's really loaded in information. The problem is how this information is laid out, and it's presented, it's criticized, and so on. So first of all, for those who do not know him, Diamond is a biologist, physiologist, ornithologist, anthropologist, geographer, right, etc. He comes from Boston. He's an American author, and when you see all this curriculum laid out like that, okay, the first thing that comes into my mind, you can't be expert about all of this stuff, right? He's not a historian as well, and I would say, as a historian, he will forgive me for that, but I doubt he would ever care about this video. But let's say I have something to say about this, and also because he actually interestingly addresses in positive terms the role of historians. That is to say, he comes to his conclusions by saying that fundamentally historians are kind the best people among the various so-called scientists, and compared to the other, say, hard scientists that basically mostly, according to him, experiment and do not think about the circumstances why a certain value emerges like that, right? Whereas the historian, this is something we explained on Schwerpunkt many times, has to work with no basis of such kind. It has fundamentally to look back at the every logical connection that brought to certain things. So the causes, the remote causes, as Diamond says. And I just wrote down a bit of points where I was reading the book so that I could discuss it a bit more, as a sketch. And I will first of all say that I will not criticize the contents of every single chapter. I will do it here and there. Probably I will cover all the chapters properly, but I will not cover them in the sense that I'm not competent about all the various topics he addresses, because he literally starts talking about history of agriculture, history of domestication, certain history of technology. It's a pretty long book, as you understood, and it's information that is easy actually to process, because he admits at the beginning that this is not properly a scientific book. He says, I will not be writing this as a scientist step by step, also because it would have been prohibitive given the amount of topics he covers and the enormous complexity that exists and that he skips. Let's be honest about that for each of these topics. So he says, I will present them in a easy way, right? I can say a disclosuring one, but almost, right? Which is also very useful, because this is a book that is really useful for anyone who wants to get the essentials of all these various branches, right, of natural science, and that wants to get basically the ABC, and then maybe it can be a starting point for deepening the knowledge of them. But definitely, I guess that for every specialist in that field, each of these chapters is like a stabbing to the earth, meaning that the author basically skips all the, not the major. I mean, he points out, especially for the renowningly list known realities, such as the timing in the population of certain continents by the human species and so on. The major controversies, the uncertainties that exist in every field, right? And it's kind of strange in that regard that he skips history among all of this. That is to say, you're trying to make literally a history of mankind in the last 13,000 years. Now we will understand what for, and concentrating mostly on a question that basically has to do just with the last millennia, and you don't fundamentally concentrate in the same period. And why? Well, because of course there is a sort of deterministic approach, a mechanistic and deterministic approach that is based mostly on a geographical and ecological base. That is to say, according to him, most of the reasons why human society is evolved in a certain way, stages of development, etc., are determined by geography and ecology, the environment fundamentally. And there is here a question at the beginning that is the aim of, the reason for which the book has been written. That also makes it a bit more controversial. Basically, he was also, as we've seen, an anthropologist. He was in love with New Guinea, with the local Aborigine populations and so on. And basically, he explains that he decided to write this book because a New Guinean native asked him during one of his, travels there, why is that fundamentally the colonizers, the Australians, the Westerners, had come to New Guinea with this overwhelming amount of material wealth, fundamentally, and technology and medicines and so on, what the natives acquainted to English at that point inserted in their, adopted in their language as cargo, as an omnicomprehensive term. And Diamond says, I was puzzled by that question because, if he had, as he did, asked me, a specific question about, I don't know, biology, physiology, anthropology, I would have, geography would have been precise in the answers. But that one, was too complex to be answered. And as I was saying before, I like the author because it's very straightforward, it's very honest. He even realizes the controversy of the method that he uses. But the first thing that puzzled me a little bit at the beginning, and that's why I stressed that this thing was written in 1996. So a time where we discuss about certain things in a slightly, not so slightly different way from today, is that this book is being written explicitly to counter fundamentally racist, Eurocentric views on the development of mankind, and more specifically, of course, the pseudoscientific idea, properly of racist kind, that certain that there would be essentially biological differences at the base of cultural development, which is of course being debunked by any scientific standard at this point. And you realize at the beginning that the author is very passionate about this because he writes like the 90s were like a bit the peak of the West, right? And there was this first introspective idea from this side, kind of more open-minded scholars to say, okay, well, we have to counter these intrinsic prejudices that did exist, and they did exist a lot. I remember, more than when today at the time, at least people were more open about it, at least. About this idea, how many times you've heard those things, that people is lazy, that's why they didn't develop into, what we call a civilization. They don't have planes, skyscrapers. The Westerners invented everything. They colonized the world because they were the most advanced. These are typically, in fact, racialistic or racist, more directly, theories, mostly developed from the mid-19th century, from the time of Gobineau, that eventually met with, let's say, the bad evolutionistic side from Spencer, that kind of betrayed Darwin's ideas in a sense. So we all know what we're talking about. I'm actually always very straightforward on the fact that we have emphasized a bit too much the fact that racism is just a modern invention. Yes, if we talk about the pseudo-scientific theory as it's been laid out in that time, yes, indeed, that's something new historically, but don't think that behind other forms of discrimination or xenophobia in the past, it wasn't actually part of the same contempt and violence and, levels of oppression that eventually stem from racism from the 19th century. But as a historian, personally, I do take racism seriously from a personal point of view, because I think it is objectively a problem in the world that deserves attention. I mean, it's just one of the many, right? And just like, I don't know, think about what happened in the United States last year. For the media, it's just racism, right? It's not margination, poverty, social problems, political problems. It's just racism. Of course, everything gets blended in. So, yes, you cannot really dissociate it from the rest, but just as the other factors, and naturally simplistic explanations are always false by definition. So it's never a monofactual explanation. And yet we have to be very careful about, stressing too much something. Otherwise, people will fundamentally even believe in it and become even more polarized, and we won't solve the problem because we won't even address the causes of the issue. But in this sense, I was surprised by the fact that the author was so declarately, open about the fact that this book was designed just fundamentally to explain that. I mean, to debunk, more than answering the New Guinean guy's question, to debunk Western-centric racist ideologies, right? And at that point, if I had to write the same thing, I would have simply stuck essentially to biology. because that's literally all what you need to know. I mean, of course, other fields also show you that, right? But if the easiest thing is that, if you prove that given a certain genetic background, there is basically no difference in terms of intellectual capacity, and even if there was, this is irrelevant compared to the enormous complexity of and it can even be calculated, because if it is, it's minimal, and it's not even racially based, and it's something that at that point you could discriminate somebody for any cause at any moment, and it would be even virtually insignificant at that point. So it's something completely, I presume that if you study the history at university, you can't be a racist by definition, because it's such a stupid idea that every ism at that point should be rejected. Unfortunately, it's not the case. Like, it's not the case for any other isms that are out there. How many fascists or communists have you met in your life that had secondary education? Well, let's be honest about the fact that secondary education, like education in general in the Western world, like in any other place in the world, sucks, right? Our educational standards are radically useless at many levels for what they should actually serve for. It's mostly about lack of discipline, of actual amount of study, of selection processes. That is, every idiot can take a degree and go out there and pretending that he has a competence. And this is showed by, in fact, how few a degree actually is worth on the market today, because the market doesn't lie in that regard. And we all realize that at this point in history, at least the relative value of such titles is very, 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 very low. Right, and this told you, as you know, from a person that has just submitted a PhD thesis, and that won't be using his title for saying, okay, I'm the best guy ever because I don't give a damn. To me, we're all capable of learning equally, and of course, people that had a more structured path should be tendentially better than others, but that has nothing to do with the fact that whether they're actually satisfactorily, intelligent people for what we need in the world to make it work in a decent sense, right? So never confuse titles with actual competence, because it's quite never the case. But as I was saying before, I would have actually dedicated, if I had to answer to debunk racism, I would have just stuck to a biological situation, right? Because also because the author, in a sense, in this book actually leaves space, in a sense, for a kind, at least, of cultural racism to be still on the fore, right? Because frankly, and I tell you this, I don't think I ever actually known a person that actually believes in pseudoscientific racism. I believe most people that I know that are racist are actually into cultural racism that is not even properly racism. That is to say, it's just culture, admittedly, right? And so racism, by the way, is just racism, right? You can't be discriminatory in other ways, and if it's from a cultural point of view, unless you don't connect it to us alleged biological superiority and inferiority, you're not technically a racist. You can be an asshole, but not necessarily that. This is just because I care about the terminology as well. So I was surprised that the author actually decided to extrapolate from all possible explanations, however, that would have been even more fitting, considering that he studied evolutionary biology. I mean, he's a guy that did his homework, and it's definitely shown in the book. Not just to two factors that are fundamentally a geographical and an ecological ones. That is essentially, yes, at the end of the day, what the continents were shaped like, what kind of climates they were, because that's what it gets down to, right? He explains rather well why he makes that point, right? He basically, and that's the title of the book, that Eurasia, in practice, was this larger land mass with a west-eastern longitude that with a certain temperate climate that allowed the selection of certain for agriculture of certain species and domestication of animals, etc., that favored context that was blessed, let's say, by certain climatic environmental characteristics, and that was more in contact with each other, and that with also more diversifying elements here and there, that brought to this, to boosting the kind of complication of the system and to develop more. It's an interesting explanation. I mean, it's obvious that this is a factor that did surely influence human history. There's no doubt about that. The problem is, given that the precise question that he poses in the book is like, why did the Australians seize New Guinea, and not New Guinea seized, I don't know, London or something like that? It's a question that is obviously to be answered from, if not a few millennia, but still considering that it's not just much about the aborigines of New Guinea, but it's mostly why did the British create the most extended empire in the world by the 19th century and came to there, which is random in a way, right? Because, and that's where he skips completely history. That is to say, Britain might have not gotten to that, right? And if it did, it did for reasons that definitely are not listed in there. So it doesn't actually, yes, that is more broadly the Westerners, not specifically the British or whatever. But why Europe? So it, expanded, the age of expansion, colonialism, and so on, did that, and not the Indians and not the Chinese that, compared with up to a few millennia before, were dramatically more advanced than anything that existed in Europe. If that is the explanation, you already understand from a dialectical point of view that whichever, selection in agriculture or domestication of animals and so on happened before, and for factors that are, kind of more on the long run, back in more than 10,000 years ago, cannot be quite the decisive factor, the actual explanation. Why exactly Guns, Germs and Steel? And we have a problem with the title as well, given what the author actually wrote, because the thesis at the end of the day is fundamentally that by domesticating certain animals, the Eurasians, and specifically the Europeans, for reasons that even in there not clearly outlined, essentially got more resistant to certain viruses that passed from animals to mankind. Therefore, there was a selection for which, at the time, Cortez destroyed the Aztec Empire. Most of the reason was fundamentally the natives had died, not butchered by the Spanish, that surely did that en masse, but overwhelmingly more by germs, right? To which those guys, given that they had just basically dogs and llamas, and not all kind of species that existed in Europe that had, long coexisted with men in mass and with, large bodies of people, hadn't developed, right? That's kind of the most punching argument. The idea that Europeans expanded not much just because of their technological superiority that he stresses, right? And you know that on Schwerpunkt we do not actually indulge in technologistic prejudices, so we will explain that in a while as well. But fundamentally, the most punching factor was germs, right? The fact that we wiped out, back in the day, millions and millions and millions of people just by sneezing, right? Accidentally, as you understand. In a way that not even Europeans could foresee, because they didn't understand much about that at the time. Nobody did. So one aspect, of course, Europeans were also fragile. Think about malaria, to which other peoples were more resistant and so on, but it still didn't have the same effect, because altogether they were kind of more resistant compared to those amounts of illnesses compared in this broader ratio. Then he stresses guns, referring specifically to firearms in that regard, and steel, right? And surprisingly enough, in this book, while there is a lot written on illnesses, there's actually very few written on guns and steel, right? And even trying to explain there why this would have been actually so relevant at the end of the day. As you know, on Schwerpunkt, we do not believe that technology provides, you with a decisive superiority, because even when there is an actual edge that is provided by that, the same edge is floating on a mass like of other factors that are render technology virtually insignificant in the whole process. So that if you had taken that out of the equation, still technology would have not been enough. And this is like the basics of any kind of history of technology, and even history of warfare. And that's a topic that he completely skips, right? He skips at a level that gets disturbing, because he at a point towards the beginning where he actually exemplifies before the list of chapters that treat of all the various branches of epidemiology, of agriculture, of technology, and so on, where he doesn't discuss that thing either. The Spanish conquest of the Inca's empire, and specifically starting from the letter of Pizarro to Charles V about the capture of Atahualpa, the Inca's emperor. He basically, the author chooses this example. So what happened is that the Spanish arrived in this, in the Inca's empire after a civil war. That, first of all, the author, what is fascinating is that the author actually touches all the single factors that might have actually been the most important ones, but he doesn't give a damn about, right? He just extrapolates germs, guns, and steel, right? And we'll see in a while, right? Because he could have said horses as well, right? He doesn't explain why he restricted the choice to that. And in this passage, fundamentally, the Spanish were just a few hundred. They had arrived in the face of the Inca Imperial Army site, and they were basically going to Atahualpa to talk, because Pizarro himself said, if we had showed ourselves to be weak in front of the Incas, they would have exterminated us, right? Instead, they reached Atahualpa, and they managed to capture him, to slaughter his guard, to put on the route all the army that was around, because basically these guys have been frozen by the fact that the living symbol of the empire, from which all authority derived and everybody obeyed to, allegedly, had been seized, had been captured by these guys that were, like, it's a bit how it happened with Cortez, and that was invited into the Aztec capital because they thought that the Spanish were gods, right? And they made the mess that failed, and eventually they came back and they seized the capital again. Now, from this episode, Diamond, that has listed all the various factors, that is, evidently the psychological, the cultural divide, right? The fact that, for example, the Incas believed that was their emperor was an omnipowerful entity, allegedly, and that the Spanish were kind of more, as Europeans, more egalitarian-minded after all, in terms of political power, even though their own was much more structured, etc. This evident psychological collapse, right? That all these swarms of natives basically collapsed just in front of a few hundreds Spanish, right? That had surely horses, that had guns, that had steel, but there were just a few hundred guys, right? And from exclusively from that example, and I stress it, exclusively from that example, because it doesn't quite touch the topic anymore in a political and military sense, and having listed even these moral factors, that's where he coins the title of the work: Guns, Germs, and Steel. That is, moral forces. For Clausewitz is rolling in his grave at this time. Where are moral forces in this? Right? It's fascinating. The author even listed accurately the fact that the Spanish had an edge, due also to the fact that they had a written culture, that they had all kind of from the history of Western thought, critical, rational thinking, a different way, a specific kind of education, of replicating. So it's obvious that Native Americans had a completely different mindset under many points of view. But fundamentally, and that was an interesting, let's say, element to, path to develop, to capitalize upon, to explain, to give this explanation. But no, it was just about guns. It was just about steel, right? And germs that naturally wiped out millions and millions, as well, facilitating, in part at least, the European expansion, which at some point it's even given for granted that occurred because these guys had more advanced metallurgy or firearms. And the question is, do you know, like, the military history of of the Americas during the 16th century, and do you know how many times the Europeans came to grips with native armies that were actually a very hard nut to crack? Do you know that up to the 18th century, the Europeans all over the world faced important defeats at the hands of way less developed peoples? Yes, of course, there is to say that these guys learned, for example, to learn how to use horses, firearms. For anyone who knows North America, but general Native American history knows how quickly these peoples learned actually to cope with, which is a point that naturally Diamond uses to show that, of course, human beings are human beings, and they're all alike, and they all learn fast when they're presented with the best options. So surely there are certain limiting factors, but this is not entirely the whole point of why the Spanish arrived, why the French, the English arrived, not, I don't know, the Indians or the Chinese, not entirely. And that doesn't explain even among why Europeans, those people arrived and others not, right? Or whether they would have had it at that time, right? And another, okay, we'll talk all about these things later. So I was astonished as a Clausewitzian to realize that in this regard a bit the moral dimension of the story is not touched, right? Even when Diamond talks about politics, he mostly does it in function of basically on the intervention of technological development, when he explains, for example, how the Chinese stopped by the 17th century to send this large maritime expeditions up to East Africa with tens of thousands of individuals, because the faction that was against the one that controlled the navy basically took over, and they decided to enclose China after and not to send those expeditions anymore. And in general, with I would say politics, as far as concerned, especially the fact that Europe was more fragmented than other areas because of natural barriers, because the fact that in Europe there is no main river that basically allows to control the broader continent, like, I don't know, in China or in other areas like India, and at least in part even in there, because that there is a degree of approximation that is not quite treated to, in a sense. Another fact that maybe has not much to do with this, but that triggered me a little. First of all, I can't stress it enough. Those Spanish that seized Atahualpa were not winning. This is the point. Were not winning just because they had guns or horses or steel. They were winning because they had the freaking moral force to say, okay, we're going to go in the mouth of the wolf, and because we're dead anyway, and therefore fighting to the death, and having that kind of vision. Of course, that vision derived from Western civilization. But if those guys had not done it, if they had a different leader, if they, for some reason things would have gone wrong, today we would not be talking about that, and we couldn't even use that example as, a proof that, that, as we've seen also, we don't really have to understand why it was, in fact, guns and steel that made the freaking thing, right? So it's fairly well known, for example, that if the Aztecs or even the Incas had been politically united at that point, they hadn't started actually killing each other in the process. When the Europeans arrived, Europeans would have not made an headway in there, right? This is fairly well known to anybody who's acquainted to the conquest of the Americas, and those specific, especially with Cortez and Pizarro. So where's that, right? Why that determinism? Why that specific example to prove, systems of such an overwhelmingly complicated complexity that it's difficult even to explain. Here there is no actual interest in the historical method. There is no interest, of course, from the author that admits to openly to be biased in this, that surely he is making things simpler because for the sake of making a synthesis of 13,000 years of history in 300 pages, that he admittedly declares to be controversial, right? But not addressing the unpredictability of reality, not addressing the ideal, the individual history, is a way also to flatten kind of the value of humanity, right? If you're trying to make a book that is countering racism, and in part you're doing it well, because we all agree on that, and there are examples to prove it naturally, but why not stressing, for example, the brilliance of human mind, let's say, and in not just in a long-term comprehensive way, like for example the chapter when he explains how prehistoric peasants began to select the best cultivations and improving them, etc., and not stressing the fact that somebody did something, like choosing to go from A to B to make a freaking difference, because most of those people are unknown in the story, because we're talking about areas thousand years ago where there's no history, there's no written recording, but we know that somebody did it, somebody started. Even Diamond even says that, but he doesn't quite focuses on it, doesn't reflect on it, on the fact that humans can make a huge difference on their own individually, with their individual choices. We'll see it better, right? Because that is what actually changed the history of mankind, at the point of even of determining, probably together with a lot of other factors that would have not been enough by themselves, but that therefore don't make even that last factor enough by itself, so decisive by itself, the West or the East to take over the world, for example, in the last millennium. Another thing that I was a bit discontented by is that I think he rules out a bit too hastily the concept of civilization proper, right? Of course, he is criticizing there the kind of against the social evolutionism, that the racist idea that certain peoples are less capable because of biological differences and then others are super because they did stuff, right? That's an idea that, especially in the United States, because frankly, being raised in Europe, before I was acquainted with certain American idea, it's not interiorized, right? Europe had racism, we had colonialism, we did horrible things, but let's say I don't think we are so theoretically loaded with this simplification of the idea that fundamentally there is a race that is superior to others, and that trying to compare in this mechanistic way. Like, I've heard some of the weirdest things in that regard, and frankly I'd never heard them here, right? It's no surprise. I mean, the United States had a history of, think about slavery, how much that informed, even after the secession war. From an ideological point of view, white supremacists kind of won the idea, in spite of the fact that slavery was over, and segregation, by the way, was still there, in an extremely different way from what happened in Europe, right? Where we still did horrible things all around the world, but still in our continent we had a different view of that. So sometimes, was even detached from in terms of even a memory of our past, of what actually the real thing is. And it's a serious topic, right? So obviously Diamond is speaking as an American in his time legitimately, because he does well against this concept of a race is superior to another and demolishing it, right? But in the process he basically butchers a bit also the idea that fundamentally there is a value in civilization, and that this civilization is happens to be, at least to have been developed by Westerners at a certain level up to a certain point, right? I totally agree with him when, it's the historical fact that Europe was fundamentally invested mostly by Middle Eastern influences, and kind of civilization progressed from the Mediterranean, that the North, the widest was literally the least developed part of the continent. It would remain up to, a millennium or more, a little more ago. But exactly for this reason, you cannot deny the value of civilization just to make a rhetorical point when it comes from the East, and not acknowledging the value of civilization when this is developed in the West, right? It doesn't make any sense, right? Because I personally attribute to civilization a universal value because it has to do fundamentally with human intelligence. Right. I know that there are kind of survivalistic, primitivistic stance attitudes, that is to say, an hunter-gatherer in prehistoric times essentially had it easier than an average Western in the 21st century. I personally disagree, but to the root with that. Diamond doesn't quite, once again, he points that out, but doesn't explain. He passes by, because literally, I understand him. Like, you couldn't write a book by going in depth with all this stuff, but at least you should take into consideration that in that statement there is still an enormous debate that invests all these fields of evolutionary biology, anthropology, sociology. I mean, it's something so overly complicated that nobody, let's say, can get down to in practice, right? So of course it's fine to have impressions, just in opinions just expressed, and today you can find somebody that disagree with them, you debate about it, it's fine. That's how we should have a scientific development in the first place. But let's say I don't buy the fact fundamentally that what the West basically achieved in in this fundamentally very recent time, and is something intrinsically to put in relativistic terms, right? There is evidently something there, that is the increase of life quality in the last 20 years has been dramatic. Like, in the history of mankind, there's never been anything like that. We're talking about billions of people having finally in a few decades something that nobody had ever had before, and with standards of living that are ever closer to the standards of West, of a satisfactory existence, even in the Western world. So again, I wouldn't dismiss so easily that the Westerners actually have a value of civilization that others didn't quite reach in quantitative and qualitative terms, and that this happens to be random. It's not a racial question. It's literally, the thing was done. It's verifiable along certain standards. You can discuss those standards, but here I won't even list things like, the West didn't quite become the West just because it fundamentally exploited somebody. So especially today, right? Today it's completely wrong. I mean, if you have an idea of how world economy practically works, you can't say that, right? It is true in colonialistic times, but today it's not even. And even in those times, you can even actually come to question whether those peoples that were being colonized, but whether they were actually doing something bad or wrong. Because frankly, I don't see what's the moral value compared to any human moral standard of these times that you can find as actually better than a 19th century European reality. I mean, tribal societies are exclusively based on extermination, rape, and slavery, right? Of course, there are peoples that are so primitive, sometimes they don't even have, they're not very warlike, but that we're talking about very small societies isolated here and there. I mean, the Aztecs were basically there was something horrifying, to say the least. And it's not because the Europeans in that regard were not horrifying, also because of what they did in the Americas, but still, there was something better, and there is no doubt about that. And find somebody else that at the time was like that. Because humans learned to do stuff. Like, they were not better intrinsically because those were Europeans or whatever, but because they had achieved stuff. And we know, biologically speaking, evolutionarily speaking, that humans are programmed to have a better existence if they achieve stuff, right? And that achievement cannot be taken away. We cannot be relativized. I'm not saying we have to absolutize it either, but it surely is not to relativize it as well, right? So that's kind of a rhetoric that to me didn't sound nice. But I stress it. I like Diamond the way he says, it was unavoidable from his standpoint in the 90s probably to make these points, and I understand that, right? Especially to an American audience, I understand the rhetoric as well. But I'm just saying, if a person reads it today, may find it, just like me, I never read it, can find it a bit debatable. There is also, at some point he uses, he doesn't speak much of a history of warfare, but he makes some, weird remark, like on the concept of civilization, for example, that if I'm not wrong, that the fact that there are peoples that do not have writing and that do not have a state and so on are not necessarily inferior to those who have, because look at the Huns with the Romans. Now, okay, every people comes from a different background, but again, we can't relativize, but especially what are you proving exactly with the example of the Huns with the Romans? Like, what is the example? Is that the Huns destroyed the Roman Empire, created another empire? The Huns were some of the most overrated reality that they arrived to, if you want to make examples, look at the Avars, like look at the Mongols, of course that he does, but pointing out that, the Huns at certain point sacked the Roman Empire in part and then eventually, evaporated, diluted, and the Roman Empire went on, and other peoples that were invested by the Huns went on. How is that a proof that, the Huns were kind of not, as civilized as the Romans? Were, let's say, I don't even know what we was trying to say at that point. It's obvious that the Romans were more civilized, and it's obvious that at the end of the day, that was the empire was still standing, and the Huns disappeared from the face of history. So, in my I don't see like much of a historical insightfulness, and that was already a spy to say, okay, watch out, right? He knows also history. He can explain very well certain things. The book has also an appendix that was added later about Japanese history, for example, how the Japanese were formed culturally, all the problem of their also ethnical identity that is so important to them, that is also in opposition to other countries, to other cultures, and all historical problems. He knows the stuff. He studied, he researched them, but at the end of the day, it's still the way he lays it out is a synthesis. And it doesn't even seem to be useful to the point that he's making. That is, he's throwing example here and there, but it doesn't get to the point. You see, the work has this initial premise about racism, about this guns, germs, and steel, basically only deriving from the Atahualpa episode, and then a beautiful list of chapters that are theoretically loaded with that kind of scientific information, but that are theoretically loaded with, connected with questions. That is to say, why then, there is always the same question, then why, was it the Westerners and not these other peoples that prevailed? And most of the times that he starts this chapter, the answer is, we don't know. And the rest of the chapter goes on with saying, okay, look at how different it is, and therefore, yes, you can't say that the Westerners had kind of a biological superiority. Yes, but who is that believes that? And what is that you're actually proving with this astonishing list of information that do not actually answer the question, are not framed even into a dialectical channel to answer that question that is still not answered, right? There are very good points when he makes when, for example, I was fascinated with the interconnection within the same continents. The fact, of course, that Eurasia was more favored, also because of the more east-west axis, while Africa and the Americas, for example, were not, because they were mostly on a north-south, and certain areas were more difficult to pass. The Sahara and Central America, see that certain species didn't actually pass from one place to another. Where in Eurasia there was more connection. Oh, fine, that is very good, and intuitively, that's something that you can understand, even if you're not a biologist, or an ornithologist, an anthropologist, or a geographer. I mean, it's obvious that Eurasia was more interconnected. But was that enough, like completely, to say, okay, at the end of the day, the West took off, right? of course, probably the Eurasians were the ones you would have bet the most at that point. Yes, I agree with that, but was that enough? Was that decisive? And how do you demonstrate that? You can't demonstrate that, as we will see, because there is no way to predict that. There is no way to sort that out systematically, even in the fact that it happened, because first of all, we don't know exactly how certain things happened. And history especially shows us quite clearly that things could have taken completely different turns, right, for reasons that had literally nothing to do about how continents were oriented or, what kind of climate was there, but literally whether a person died or lived, or a person decided to do something or not. I mean, this is a book in which, there's not even the mention of Alexander. I mean, are we kidding? Like, what would have been Western history, Asian history, if Alexander had not existed? I mean, seriously. Have you ever questioned that? What if Christianity had not emerged? What if the Romans, had succumbed to the Italics rebelling when Hannibal invaded Italy? Do you think the world would have been actually the same? That Europe would have taken off in the same way? That colonialism would? Of course not. Right? It's impossible. We know, even just by strategical analysis today, that there is no way to predict politics even in 4 months from now. I give you that at the time things were relatively simpler and less kinetic, let's say, had a lower potential, but, you can't predict them either. Right, even things like, the fact that the Chinese Empire was more closed in itself because it was kind of more authoritarian, dirigistic, whatever, that switched lights off, as Diamond says, by, deciding not to make maritime expeditions anymore. What if, there hadn't been the Jusian's plague? What if Muhammad had not existed? What if... at that point, Western Europe would have remained, for example, under a Byzantine orbit? What if the Byzantines could consolidate their autocratic rule also in the West? What if, that would have radically changed the history of the West as well? And we don't know whether things would have gone the way they would, right? There is too much that we have to... it's not easy to give such explanations. What if the Mongol conquests are not taking place? That changed. There was a big game changer. What if the Ottomans had not risen? Those were extremely easy things to avoid. Extremely easy things to avoid, right? And we know it. If anybody, we made lots of videos on this stuff. We know that literally it was something so unpredictable, even in the range of a few years at the time. How the heck can you say that the Westerners were destined, were not destined, because he doesn't say that, but they were favored at the point that that's the answer to the question? It doesn't make much sense, right? There are certain big factors. He identifies them well, yes, but were they decisive? No. Can you demonstrate otherwise? No. And he doesn't. And he doesn't even try. And he doesn't take into consideration these historical factors that are fundamentally the most important ones, right? For example, even when he deals with politics in this regard, he mostly does it by discussing... he doesn't even put a dramatic emphasis on the concept of state building along modern terms. I mean, he's actually, he repeats it more than once, but let's say... he still doesn't say how the Europeans actually arrived to that process, right? Or at least he doesn't insist that much. He refers to the fact that compared to China, yes, they were more fragmented, but how did the thing arrive to that? There would be also interesting, certain intuitions are also right, but he doesn't develop them. For example, China and India were renowningly more advanced than Europe for a long time, right? But when is, for example, that speaking of steel that appears in the title, when is the Europeans start making the difference in that regard? Well, even though China and India remain more advanced for a while, we know that Europeans from the 1300 started to produce steel, albeit in a less systematic way, but still with a quality that would essentially would already surpass the Indian and Chinese realities, right? As we were saying before, there is not even an important point. That is that the fact that basically up to the end of the 7 Years' War, the greatest world power was indeed China, still at that point, and remarkably so. There were also other political realities in Asia that could have actually turned into something else. This doesn't even he doesn't even address, for example, the potential of the various British. I mean, there are for example, lots of authors that, according to me, make it even worse. That is to say, for example, that give a centrality just to the kind of scientific thinking that was developing in Britain at some point. I don't think it's enough, even in there. Like, the world didn't change because of 18th century Britain proper, right? That, again, gave it a dramatic boost, but it's not, you can't isolate it as a factor in saying, that is decisive in absolute terms for the rise of the West. No, because probably still the French or the Spanish would have done the same thing, even with different rhythms, with different capacity, but still, how did that influence the world would have been an interesting discussion, right? So, Diamond is clever because he actually lists all the possible factors, but still, I don't know why he shrinks to just a few of them, and he doesn't, in my opinion, provide a cogent explanation for it. Also, indeed, as a military historian, I can't help to stress that here there is no attention to a broader political, strategical culture. I mean, war is treated basically just in technological terms, right? Why did the Spanish win over the natives? It's because they had horses. It's because they had guns. No, it's not because of that, right? And there is a point there that he makes, and I don't remember exactly where, but he says something like that. Basically, the natives had no chance because the Spanish had steel, and therefore their cuirasses could not be penetrated. I mean, read Jan Heath's, for example, armies of the Aztec and Inca empires, and read all the freaking lists of accounts written by the same Spanish about Native American weapons and what they could do actually against even their armored opponents, right? Look at what the struggle, look at the effort, look at the power, the capacity, and you will realize there that technology was not it was, of course, like it's never historically, not even remotely close to this being decisive in military matters, and how actually, these peoples were pretty resourceful and they were politically united. They were definitely very, very hard opponents for the Westerners as well. So, no, that's especially the thing that, given that I'm more into that compared to other topics, I don't buy. I could say the same things, for example, about the controversies relative to the, as I was saying before, the timing of the settlement of humans in the various continents. I've read something about that at a point. I've listened to certain controversies, even to pseudoscience at some point that I don't believe in, but from a methodological point of view, given that I'm a person that is, I specialize in the 14th century, so I have a very, everything I say, I have to source it properly. When you look at prehistory, when you look at these times where you have just one evidence every, tens of thousands of years, you already know that evidence is not so relevant and applicable to the whole picture, right? As if it was a matter of fact, right? There are too many factors that we have zero idea about, and this is already something that you can start sensing in the Middle Ages, in the ancient world. There are certain things that we simply don't know and we can just speculate about. And, if this is something that happens just for 2,000 years ago, you can imagine for 15,000 years ago how that can be. What the hell do we know? How do we know exactly about the levels of population? It's just, those are fields, like in prehistoric warfare, etc., where you have such a scarce amount of evidence that scholarship basically it gets at each other's throat because it's not history. It starts becoming ideology. That is to say, people do not propose theories because they actually have any point to that, but just because they shift a little comma and they start expanding on it with their fantasy rather than with actual demonstrability. And there is a value deontologically, ethically, you know, intellectually to say, okay, we just do not know. But of course, everybody has to. I know archaeologists kill each other like that all the time, right? And part of the reason is because these various branches do not even use an homogeneous scientific method. They are terribly biased by their own way of thinking, like everybody is, right? Also historians, but the point of historians is at least that they try to make sense a bit of all the evidence that all these fields, specialistic fields, take, right? But they learn, perhaps better than others, that it shouldn't be taking them for granted, right? You would be surprised by how interdisciplinarity actually brings to these problems. That is to say, let's say I'm a physiologist and I have to believe or rely on what an anthropologist tells me. If I know nothing about anthropology, how can I even, in my own scientific inquiry, how can I integrate what the anthropologist said if I'm not even sure he's right? And these are certain topics that are so loose and modifiable, etc., that you cannot be certain about anything at that point, but by a very large degree, right? And therefore, even for the method that Diamonds uses, let's say, yes, he's definitely he knows the literature, he read from all of these, but it's just the sum of those, the broader consensus, not the actual problems explained. And there are huge debates about each of the topics he lists, and he completely skips them because he has to make a point that at the end of the day he doesn't demonstrate. It's a beautiful read, it makes you learn a lot of stuff, but does it answer to the question? No, or better, he thinks he does, and provides one that, in this sense, doesn't help people to realize what the scientific method, the historical method, practically is. And it just tells you, you see, this guy said it in that book that is famous, so I have to repeat it so it becomes true, right? It's like, for example, when the Maori exterminated other people in that closer island to New Zealand, the Maiori, I don't remember how they're called, right? That passed to, because I've heard it elsewhere on the internet and so on, as the fairy tale of the terrible, which it's culturalist bullshit, by the way. This the heaven of Keegan and all these other guys that are, study von Clausewitz, please, of the terrible warlike people, because as if war was a problem of culture, right? Not because it was something human and universal. The Maori were so evil, they exterminated these guys. You go see there, and there is an account from one of these the people who was exterminated, that they even said they were like double time. The Maori were double time their number. Well, even just from a military point of view, you can't really, let's say, if they had been 1 to 50 and those guys had been all exterminated, you would start to think, yes, maybe there was something strange in that culture. It would be, related to mostly moral forces, you would think in Clausewitzian terms, but they're important to investigate. You see, winning 1 to 2 is not this enormous feat. It definitely speaks of a, concrete reality, but even in there, Diamond doesn't explain whether those people that were exterminated were actually completely military-less, right? And how can you calculate in tribes of that proportion? And is that just the story of the, because it was used not as a culturalist example, but let's say still as a proof of the fact that certain peoples can develop in such different ways that even if they were so close and divided between each other by the sea, by the way, even if geographically the distances were close, how different outcomes can be. Well, I'm not entirely convinced of that, and this brings us back also to the Spanish against the Native Americans. That is mainly the Aztecs and the Incas. That is a bit the leitmotif as an example of in the book. That is to say, if you really have studied the military history of that phase, you know that, of course, those peoples, yes, they were kind of backwards compared to the Spanish, but still that there were mainly political reasons for which they were weak and they didn't actually put up an effective resistance. It's not just germs, it's not just guns, it's not just steel, right? The Spanish were also defeated, were also halted, right? And not just by malaria or the environment. But there is a lot to say about it, and this is not said. I mean, it doesn't even take that perspective into consideration. There is, well, what else could I say? Yeah, I mean, the historical process that here we're talking about, towards the end, he makes a point that is the one I already hinted at before, that is, he praises historians, right? And that's where, and this is not the first time I hear it, because as a historian I should be pleased by it, right? But I was really not, because I think it was terribly naive as a compliment, and also wrong. Why? Because he laments, essentially, the fact that in his privileged fields, that are mostly the ones of natural science, there is too much reliance on, let's say, purely scientific measurements, right? Physical ones, essentially, biological ones, and not much, let's say, an habit to reflect on the broader causes, on the main, of on the context, right? It's the idea that it's true, right? That certain things are just done in laboratory, and the scientist is not interested in the background, but rather in the value that he will get from that, the equation. This is a problem that indeed exists in scientific subjects, but it's also a broader problem in the West. Like, those technologistic prejudices fundamentally stem from the same idea. They stem from also the mid-19th century. Before, in the West, we didn't reason like that, right? This obsession for numbers, for facts, right? Charles Dickens, satirized that brilliantly. Is an illness, like it's a mental illness. It's an actual problem, right? It's part of most of our reasons. It's a way that, however, it's something that the same diamond falls into, in a way, because in the moment in which he isolates of all the possible factors, just the geographical or the ecological ones, he denies its own, capacity of looking at the remote causes, as he points it out, because he says that historians basically instead are people that are able to look at the broader picture, that are used not to rely on the number, on the hard quantity, but just to have an idea of the world and creating an original synthesis that indeed, right, is a great merit of history that why? Because it solicitates a biological capacity of ours that is unique, that no calculator has, that only our brain has, that is the capacity of synthesis that is astonishing. This is also what von Clausewitz actually points out, for building out some military theory. So, very good point from Diamond. But he goes straight from that when he points out that this gets down to finding essentially the remote causes. That is, the historian, therefore, having the comprehensive understanding, can spot the remote cause of that, right? As he spots geographical or environmental, ecological, remote cause in the world picture. This is exactly a denial of the historical method. This is not what we do. No historian today, right, because this was a thing in the past, we had a problem of this mindset. Maybe the same, the fact that this book has been written in 1996 also has as an impact, right? When was Diamond born? Here you see 1937, right? So he would fit perfectly in that time, anagraphically speaking, in the idea that historians today do not search for a remote cause, or not even a couple, right? Or we look at things that basically tell us that up to a certain point in time, I mean, the closer in time, the more you can identify the causes, right? Just like, let's say, the closer in future, the more you can predict certain things to happen. The more you distance yourself, the more difficult it becomes to even be capable to imagining, to spot what is the factors, plural, by default to these causes. Because we know, historically speaking, that there is never a single cause. There is not, right? I know it's seducing. I know that we are used as modern people saying, it's because of that. Got it, right? It's basically 95% of people's mistakes historically speaking, today. You can read it everywhere, on YouTube, on Facebook, wherever. All people that give this single monofactual explanation saying it's just that, right? Why was World War I fought the way it was? Because of technology. No, it was not because of technology. It was largely because of politics and society and all the enormous complexity of it, that therefore it's just a floating stuff. You can't point a specific factor into that. In other external environmental factor, for sure, right? But they are so blended together that you can't arrive to say, in 13,000 years of history, or even before, that there is a straight line between that and the fact that the Europeans took off at a certain point, and in this brief, minuscule time in history, took over the world for a while, and then eventually began to lose it again. It doesn't make any sense. There is not a remote cause for that. There is not a remote cause for any of comparable dynamics of that kind. And as historians, we do not do that. As historians, we just document what happens, and we try to reconstruct the way it happened. Right? It's obvious at some point that you have to express a historical judgment and saying, yes, probably there were these causes, but we cannot fundamentally discern which ones were important. Why? Because they were all intertwined. They were all intertwined. It's like just in the Clausewitzian Trinity. It's never just military, it's never just political, it's never just social. It's all three of them contemporarily, right? And if you, and that's where Diamond betrays his scientific background, what he's criticizing from his own field. Noble thing to do. I respect him a lot for that, but he basically falls into that as well. So no, historians do not do that, and especially we should not educate historians at all to even minimally hope to find a remote cause of things, because that is automatically wrong, and it is wrong from a scientific point of view. Because this is what we do not understand, that it's anti-scientifical not to consider all the various factors that exist. That's why also science had very important problems up to this point sometimes, because, and we're beginning to realize, basically in every social science, that things were very difficultly the way that we began to develop mostly by the mid-20th century, and remain sclerotized just because there is a kind of a lobby of scholars that has to defend certain history. And especially in the scientific field, this is something that is very felt today. Because let's be honest, from the 1970s, there's not been properly any major invention that literally changed in the essentials what could be found in our average Western 1970s home, right? It's all an implementation of what already existed at the time technologically wise, and there is an important stagnation that surely is, and guess why? Because it's not technology that makes the things work. The world did change. Why? Yes, because it did. The world doesn't change because of technology. Technology is just an adaptation to other stuff we have, and something we use as a patch to fix problems we have, not because there is a progressive evolution of civilization towards who knows where, right? The qualitative improvement we were talking about before of civilization stems from that synthesis intelligence capability. That is not about finding the remote causes to things to sort out like a magic trick all the problems in the world, but having the moral material resources, intelligence to cope with current problems and fixing them and stabilizing the situation as far as we can, right? And as historians, we do fundamentally the same. We try to assess what in a certain period of history happened, not much because of why from the dawn of times, but what happened in the first place. Because this is also a positivistic view of history, to pretend that we actually know what happened historically, right? If I tell you that, as I was saying the other day, that I made a 3 years research now that shows that, in my opinion, we got most of 14th century warfare in an importantly unbalanced way, well, where is somebody else that can't tell you that? Because I haven't found this anywhere. Why? Not because there are people who have an opinion opposed to mine, but because nobody's researched what I researched, and that's why we researched, not to find, again, we know that this thing is like that, like all the list of information that Diamond provides in every chapter, without even explaining the enormous debate that exists behind every single of these fields that is not even minimally addressed, but giving those things for granted and saying, therefore, it had to happen because of a remote reason. You're building a house on the sand. There is nothing there that gives solidity to your point, right? There is no doubt of sort that geography and the environment informed human civilization. No doubt. But was it decisive? No. No, it was not. Right? You can't write a book like this and not talking about the Persian Wars, or the Second Punic War, or Alexander the Great, or Genghis Khan, because it doesn't make any sense. We know history shows us the more in depth you go, and that's exactly where the book works, because it doesn't go in depth. It gives you the false security that these things are real, and that therefore there is the big understanding of a great scientist behind it that tells you what it gets down to. Right? He admits it's controversial. He admits it's, but at the end of the day, in the latest update says, lots of things have, after 10 years, have been said, but fundamentally, in my opinion, they do not disprove my point. It wasn't even a point to begin with, right? No doubt the geographical, environmental factors made the thing, but there is no demonstration that those were decisive to answer your question, right? Because there are lots of other factors that you didn't even touch. And it's obvious, because if you have not, been acquainted to certain levels of political history or military history, or let's say history of thought, it's difficult to actually point that out. What about here in this book, for example? There's no difference between. There's no mention of, for example, the difference between Western and Eastern philosophy, of critical rational thought in the West. I mean, maybe at some point, but no comparison. Maybe a mention of that. But that's, for example, a massive game changer, and you cannot say that the Greeks happened because Greek thought happened and Western civilizations emerged from out of that pattern because Eurasia is oriented more east and west as an axis, and it has that kind of climate. It doesn't make any sense, because the reason why Greek thought emerged from that had virtually nothing to do with that, and it's so easy to understand. And I personally, I'm very perplexed, right, to say the least, when I find people that read books like these and say, okay, well, this is such a great, insightful book. It's very interesting indeed. But it has absolutely nothing to do with what it's trying to demonstrate. Like 3/4 of the book talk about stuff that do not enter in the equation. Does not enter in the equation, or even if it does, should show the overcomplication, therefore the distancing from the final point. And it's not even laid out in those terms. So I'm personally very, very perplexed about this, and I'd say that this is a work that proves brilliantly the problem that we have with modern civilization in general. I mean, at this point in history, not modern in even here in a historicistic sense, but modern in the current actual terms. That is to say, we have an enormous amount of information, but we have no idea on how to process that. We don't even make the effort anymore to set the grounds for our thinking. People exactly before the 19th century, because the 19th century, in my opinion, was the last moment where we actually said something that made a sense from a scientific, from a political point, and of course excluding all that stuff, positivism, positivism, racism, and so on. I'm talking about the good stuff, right? Not surprisingly, this channel has the avatar of von Clausewitz, and before, thinkers, scientists, they were basically all the same people, philosophers, tried to set the grounds, right? Now we stopped. Now we're obsessed by the amount of information that we receive passively and that we do not make any effort to even frame in a correct way, right? So the result is a disaster. Like in this book, you have an enormous amount of information that you induce people to reason through from a certain perspective, not talking about the others, therefore in an incredibly biased way, and therefore altering all that knowledge in a way that it doesn't even get to understanding that knowledge or what's behind that, but just getting the final sap, the final magic formula that tells you, it's all about, guns, germs, and steel, right? It's all about geographical, ecological problems. And that's how it happened, man. No. Okay, and I've been harsh because after all, it's a great read. I think everybody should read this book, and I advise warmly to read it. Right, but I warn you to be absolutely wary of what here is being done, which I stress it's not being done because of malice, it's not being done because of evil, it's not being done because of political reasons. The guy has all the reasons to be biased. He has all the reasons to write this book against racism. He has all the reasons to debunk the bullshit that there are intrinsically racially superior, inferior humans in that, and it does make a good work in showing the complexity of the world. But exactly for this, I don't understand why he has to brutally cut all that to make a beautiful, comprehensive point, to try push people always to inquiry, to research, not for the more remote causes, but for the complexity, for being able to make a synthesis, right? That's where I get disturbed by, because this guy knows too much, right, for a single person, right? I could never be all of these things at once. But the impression, as I got also from other figures that I know, is that you can't be expert about everything. You can't be. It doesn't work like that. Like, in order to be a real specialist in every field, you can't jump from here and there and then eventually coming up with a broader opinion. You should be consistently focused in a certain field, mastering that, and being able to understand what, therefore, can be complicated to a certain, also in other fields. This here is all flattened, right? And it doesn't work like that. I consider that this book won a Pulitzer Prize, right? So that tells you also about our criteria of validation of work. This is surely a great book. There's a great research behind this. I don't know how much it took to write, but and the guy lists a lot of stuff that he definitely knows, right? But it's how he puts that together that doesn't work, in my opinion. And this is what I leave you with. So for now, I stop here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.